Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Daniel Estulin, and welcome to the 10th edition of our YouTube English channel, Daniel Estulin, a program called World at Large. So let's analyze, because a lot of people have a lot of questions. Let's analyze the United States of America's modus operandi. How does the government work, especially if you consider their actions around the world? Well, Washington first ignites any conflict, then skillfully manages them, maintaining its own, let's say, separate dialogue with each side. Okay, it's a classic case of divide and conquer. Classic chess game, divide and conquer, divide and conquer. That's what you do. You divide everything in two. And it doesn't make a difference whether the conflict is Russia, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Palestine, Israel. It makes no difference where they are. It's business. It's nothing personal. And like all previous conflicts, whether we're talking about World War I, World War II, the collapse of the Soviet Union, etc., we're talking about techniques of skillful combinations, provocations, manipulations, something that Americans are very good at. You manage the agenda and play with the feelings and emotions of peoples and nations. It's carrot and stick mentality. And you may be wondering what allows them to play like this over and over and over and over again. I think the answer is very simple. The US dollar. Because whoever controls finances and information, needless to say, controls the world. Politics is a concentrated expression of economics. Don't pay attention to those that tell you, no, the United States dollar is a dying currency, and so on and so forth. These rumors are specifically started by the ideologues of this project. And so old wisdom tells you, if you are rich, tell everyone that you're poor, or at least that you're not rich. That's the way it works in rich countries. In Switzerland, they have a saying, money likes silence. And only starving deadbeats, they want to make you to believe that they're rich. Money and power love silence. And if the United States dollar ever disappeared, it will only be because of the will of its creators or by the will of fate. We know that nothing lasts forever. Civilizations fall, elites are replaced, new formulas and orders of world order emerge as the world turns. Okay, so now let's move on to the Hamas and Israel. We started talking about this yesterday. In this case, the United States of America also had its own dialogue with each of the parties. Now, Netanyahu, according to the Americans, has finally come to grips with many of his errors of judgment, or rather his shortcomings. I mean, he's a thief, period. He's a thief, he's a crook, he's a corrupt politician, like so many other corrupt politicians around the world. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt, the souvenir, the fridge magnet. It's synonymous of being a politician. You've got to be a politician, not because you want to do good public service, but you want to steal. And the longer you are in power, it doesn't matter if you're a senator or a congressman, whatever you are, you become filthy, filthy rich. Now, the ignorant, they say that Netanyahu is a close friend of Putin, and that is why Washington wants to replace him with someone more malleable. This is idiocy personified. Netanyahu's entire life is joined at the hip with the United States of America. School, Harvard, work, the Israeli embassy in the United States. He's the citizen of the United States of America. The Prime Minister of Israel is the citizen of the United States. Now, how the hell does that work? And yes, in the past, Israel or Netanyahu did have some kind of a relationship, a partnership with Putin. But that was purely conditional. And therefore, the short-term objective of the Hamas-Israeli operation has already been achieved. We've talked about this last year. And so let's move on to the long-term goals. Israel and the Jewish people, who of course live not only in Israel, will gain many benefits from the current events. Did anyone really have any doubts? Of course the Hamas attack was no surprise to the Mossad. Surprise, surprise. That is to say, they were absolutely, totally, 1000% aware, and to think, or rather believe, the cheap propaganda that neither the Vatican, nor the MI6, nor the CIA, nor the NSA, nor the FSB, nor the Chinese or the Koreans, nor anyone else on the planet Earth knew anything about this is ridiculous, as it was totally ridiculous to believe that 9/11, remember the lunatics with box cutters? No one knew anything about this. Absolutely no one. A surprise. How can people be so totally goddamn clueless? We're talking about serious intelligence agencies, not the intelligence services of the Punga Bonga tribe on the island of Chunga Changa. This is an international operation, international Illuminati operation. And of course, all the key international players, in other words, global projects, knew this. But only one project directed the process, the project whose representatives live in the United States of America and at the same time whose homeland was attacked back in October 2023. In other words, the Jews. Again, you have to understand that Islamic radicals are betting on total war, as are the Jews and as the deep state. And so taking into account the high level of preparation, including the information component of the October 23 attack, there's no doubt that the masters of the universe, the shadow masters, I'm not talking about Bilderberg. I'm not talking about Bilderberg. Important people. They perfectly understood the reaction provoked by this medieval scenes, in the plural, of murders of defenseless civilians, old women taken hostages, young women raped and murdered. And Israel's eye for an eye response by wiping Gaza off the face of the earth. Of course, we've all seen the harrowing videos of Jewish children in animal cages. Was it staged? Well, let's ask that question again. And this is also an absolutely calculated move designed to do what? To provoke a completely uncontrollable fit of rage. Jews in cages, children. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I remind you that the key question is not who pulls the trigger, again, remember that, but who pays for the proverbial bullet. And it's absolutely irrelevant whether or not there was Lee Harvey Oswald who pulled the trigger and ended JFK's life or not, but rather who paid for the bullet that ended the life of the sitting president of the United States on November 22nd, 1963. And so the forces supporting Hamas want maximum level of mutual cruelty. I'm not talking about some Arab sheik somewhere in the desert. I'm talking about the forces of the deep state. And it is irrelevant what their names are, who put helpless, small children in cages, but rather who paid for the photos of these caged children. Who paid for the bullet, who paid for the photos. And the massive bombing in Gaza have no military purpose. What's the objective of bombing Gaza into the Stone Age? Well, you mobilize hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world. Action, reaction, solution. And so the strategy of pushing Israel into the sea has not disappeared since 1949. It's been around for a long time. Only the tactics have changed. You have to understand that. And so post-war Israel, created by Holocaust survivors, was prepared for a total war, fought a total war, and won it back in 1967, and then again in 1973. Remember that the Yom Kippur War was won by the children of that first generation of settlers who took Palestine by force and claimed it as their own. And in 2023, last year, October 2023, there will be nothing left of that Israel. Because today's Israel is a weak, pampered, pusillanimous country with hundreds of thousands of cowards who neither want nor know how to fight. And so the videos of these gorgeous Israeli female soldiers singing on TikTok is simply the tip of this degeneration and degradation. And of course, the radical Islam was waiting for Israel to become a Middle Eastern version of a kind of a Holland, or today's Germany, where 40% of men want to be housewives. And so, according to this logic, in the Middle East, it will be possible to inflict a historic defeat on the entire Western world, which will undoubtedly side and has sided with Israel. But neither the West nor Israel are prepared for an all-out war of total destruction. And the enlightened West's enemy, on the contrary, is very prepared. And if you don't believe it's not only about Gaza or Syria, look at Europe as a whole. Look what's happening in Rome. Look what's happening in Milan. Look what's happening in Italy in general, in Spain, and in Germany, in France, and England. These hordes of hundreds and thousands and millions of Arab Middle Easterners clad in black, ready to wipe anything that smells or whiffs of Europe off the face of the earth. And so, as I have often commented, Islam is not a homogeneous project. That's important. But again, the Jews are not a homogeneous project either, just as the United States is not a homogeneous country. You have the Republicans, you have the Democrats, you have the red states, you have the blue states. You have two different Americas that hate each other. And thus, the consequence of solving these differences is a civil war 2.0. And so I want to analyze this, what I'm saying right now, from a conceptual perspective. What I already, again, I explained this in my last book called Global Projects at War, published in the United States of America by my American publisher, Trident Press. Go and buy that book. Read it. I talked about the Black Islam in that book. So does the strategy of Black Islam have a chance? That's a question that we need to answer. Now, initially, again, when we talk of Black Islam, the strategy itself was launched by external forces to destabilize the region and control it through controlled chaos. That's always been the case. And so in the network structures that were being created, no constructive and productive agenda was established. And so the curators of the Western intelligence services, who absolutely know everything that's going on, they saw no point in long-term planning, superficially prescribing actions in general terms. And so the desired result was achieved, and over time they got used to this created pool. It gave the impression of total control and lack of risk, and complacency prevailed. We see that across Europe. And so you had religious ideological slogans and appeals were increasingly less correlated with the real actions and plans on the ground. And so the old generation of leaders and authorities gradually retired, and they were replaced by cynical and corrupt heirs. But rather than fading and degenerating, the network structure faced internal challenges and pressures as passionate as idealistic young Muslims continue to arrive on the scene. And we see that across Europe. Europe has been invaded, and it's not going to be long before it's conquered. Now, active members created their own factions, began to independently search for the meaning of the movement's future existence, and discovered lies and loopholes of on the part of the recognized leaders. And so what followed was a split, takeover, radicalization, and the Yasser Arafats were replaced with a far more radical and intolerant extremists, and we're seeing it right now. And so network structures began to take on a life of its own, opposing their curators, the older leaders from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, who with the complacency of the West were allowed to be the controlled opposition. And so not even the financing provided as a kind of a break through the Gulf monarchies and their own control of the Wahhabis and the Salafist leaders could contain the tide, because these people, they have strong ideology, something that the older generations lost long time ago. And so this renewed Islamist movements across the Middle East and across Europe also lacked objectives and a productive agenda. In particular, former Iraqi, for example, Ba'athist officers who became the core base of the ISIS terrorists, they were able to reestablish restrictions, but were unable to independently choose a new path. And so let us consider what needs to be done to ensure that the strategy of Black Islam, in other words, the unification, consolidation, acquisition of the subjectivity of the Islamic world on religious and network principles becomes possible in the near future. Well, first of all, it's necessary to form a single spiritual center that has authority for the majority of the Ummah, given the absence of a single political space in the region. That's a very important point. And it's one thing when there is an external force capable of gathering and forcing authorities and spiritual leaders to come to a common opinion, develop principles of decision-making, coordination, and build a hierarchy between them. But we're very far from achieving these goals. And the second condition is the presence of an active group, a movement, let's say, of ardent revolutionaries who, over the next 10 to 15 years, will assume the functions of conquest, manual control, cultural reformatting of the annexed territories, and there are going to be many. Syria, oh, this is just the beginning. You have no idea what's coming down the pipe. Syria is going to be the new Libya, only worse, many, many times worse. And at the same time, all this will have to be done through hidden, indirect methods, retaining and replacing the current elite of Islamic society. We're seeing that being done right now. The Assads of this world are gone. The Gaddafis of this world are gone. The Saddam Husseins of this world are gone. Who's next? Well, we're going to see. It's not going to take too long. But I think it's possible to imagine the feasibility of the latter, but the complexity of this operation on such a enormous scale, because we're talking about 1.3 billion people, the complexity is prohibitive. And so the modern Islamic world does not even have a hint of corresponding intellectual or spiritual, organizational, managerial centers and resources that the West has had over the centuries. Which means that the latter makes the strategy of Black Islam an unattained utopia in the coming decades now. In our tomorrow's video, I will answer a key question. Why do Arabs hate Israel so much? And where do we go from here? Again, thanks for joining us. I'm Daniel Estulin. You're watching a series called World at Large, from a perspective very different from anything you're going to see in the Western media. So please support us, help us, join us. It's free, YouTube, or you can join a subscription-based channel, estulin.media, for amazing content, unlike anything you're going to see anywhere else. Again, thanks for joining us. Until tomorrow, goodbye.